And we speak now to energy expert Ms. Lungile Mashele about what has occurred over the past couple of days. Thank you so much for speaking to us and sharing your insights. Perhaps we should start with, I did mention the occurrences of the past week in terms of how Eskom explains the situation, but as you and I were saying earlier on before we went on air, was that this obviously started a few days prior. Just take us through the events and why we find ourselves here.
Thank you so much for having me. So we've had quite an eventful week in the energy space, especially in the electricity sector. And one of the key things is the unseasonal weather that we've been experiencing. Looking at the demand over the last weekend, the Easter weekend, it is uncharacteristic of the demand that we typically have over an Easter weekend. Even if you factor in the fact that this is a late Easter that we're having towards mid to late April. Then we also had flooding, excessive rains from the previous week, which then carried on into last week and this past weekend, which then affected obviously the coal. And I'll touch on this a bit later. But one of the key things is that because of the unseasonal weather that we had, it affected our renewable energy plants. Our wind and our solar were not performing optimally, especially on Friday as well as Saturday. Then over and above that, we had a very cold and wet weekend, and we know that the majority of South Africa's fleet is actually coal. So if you're going to have excessive rain, and our coal is obviously open cast mining, most of it, and even where it is stored in an open place that's not necessarily covered because you've got large stockpiles. It will get wet, especially if you consider the type of coal that we use in this country. It's of a lower quality grade, and so when it mixes with water, it sort of forms like a sludge. And this is what went into Eskom's machines, into Eskom's plant, and affected Eskom plant. So this is another issue that happened. Then over and above that, Eskom was doing their planned summer maintenance, and then you then had a situation where there was 17,000 megawatts not available on unplanned maintenance. This is unheard of for Eskom. This was a record number of breakdowns that they have experienced. Then, top it all off, their supply chains as a result of what has happened in KZN with regards to diesel as well as fuel oil. And Eskom mentioned that diesel, not so much of an issue, but fuel oil certainly an issue. And you need this for Eskom's plants. So all in all, it was the perfect storm this last week for Eskom, which then spilled into the nation.
Lungile, if I may call you that, let's just back up a bit so that we can take them point by point, because you spoke about the renewable plant failures and their inability to add to the grid. I want to find out how much these contribute to the grid. The Eskom CEO earlier on, when speaking about the IPPs in particular, spoke about 200 megawatts, and it also spoke about Eskom that it had to contain unplanned breakdown of 12,500 megawatts. So the renewable plants, how much do they contribute to the grid? And if we could also just, after that, address the issue of coal. I think South Africans have heard this issue a number of times, and it may be out of ignorance, but perhaps it's because we are ignorant. We'd ask the question, but why don't we cover the coal? Why don't we have facilities that will keep the coal dry? Why is this a constant, perennial problem?
So if I may start with the coal, one of the key issues is the large stockpiles that Eskom has. So let's recall that the coal comes from coal mines, coal seams. These are not necessarily covered. Most of it is open cast mining and is susceptible to rain and to all kinds of weather. Then there's the transportation of this coal, which for the most part is actually covered, but at the delivery points it is exposed. Then it gets to Eskom, where it is then stored, and it is stored in an open place. Now, if I might give you an example, for instance, let's take Majuba. Majuba has roughly 210 trucks that arrive there and deliver coal on a daily basis. There's no way that you can possibly cover this under some patio sort of, setup. Yes, there are ways such as having tarp, over it, but for the most part, you need a proper solution that perhaps Eskom does not have, given the stockpiles that they need to have as well. With the renewable energy plants, you will know that they are largely dependent on the weather that we have. So if we have uncharacteristic weather, and you'll recall that last week we had 2 days of really cloudy weather, in excessive rain. So on those days, your PV is not going to work. And we experienced this, I think it was the 15th of April, which would have been, I think, Thursday. Then you have the wind also, the wind turbines, which were not really operating optimally. If you look at our installed capacity, it's just at about 6,000 megawatts of renewable capacity. But on certain days, you will find that only 400 megawatts, for instance, of solar is available on really bad days.
So just sticking with the coal, we have seen the weather reports, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, the forecast of persistent rain is still there. So I'd imagine that poses a greater threat, not only to the oil, the fuel oil and the diesel that you mentioned, and you could just explain to us how that also plays into electricity supply, but particularly if we're talking about wet coal. So I'd imagine that going into the system, that the power stations, there'll be more power stations that'll lose combustion. So is there room here for some young entrepreneur, engineer here to come up with a way of either keeping our coal dry or just ways of, because this cannot be a continual problem?
Absolutely. We are not short of innovation. And I think one of the things that Eskom have been looking at for the last 10 years at least is the keeping of the coal dry. But like I've explained, these are massive places that we're referring to. You're talking about coal stockpiles of like 42 days. And if you consider that there's roughly 210 trucks a day, and you need to keep 42 days worth of stockpiles, you're not talking about a small little field that just needs to be covered. This is actually massive. But there are instances where they do use tarp, where you can cover like the coal. There are instances also where you can have some kind of a cover and shelter. But of course, innovation in this area is always encouraged. But I think one of the key things that we need to consider, especially with the wet coal, is the type of coal that we use in this country. That because it's such a lower quality, rather, when combined with water, it really does not bode well for our plants. And this is why last week we saw an unprecedented, number of breakdowns on Eskom's plant ultimately.
So the president obviously is speaking about the flood damage running into the billions, loss of productivity. He says that's still something that needs greater assessment. So with the problems that are still being experienced in terms of the Durban port, what are your predictions? The Eskom is saying it doesn't foresee us going into stage 6, but a breakdown of some of these plants, irrespective of what the reason behind it is often unforeseen. Should we brace ourselves for another difficult year?
You will recall 2020 was recorded as being the worst year for load shedding. Then 2021 broke that record. And the way things are going now, 2022 will definitely beat that record. I would rather err on the side of caution and say be prepared for an extremely cold winter, especially in the Eastern Western Cape areas, as has been announced by the South African Weather Services. But also this uncharacteristic rain that we're experiencing in the rest of the country is also what is affecting reflecting what we're going through and increasing this demand. Eskom is forecasting that in the winter months we'll be demanding about 35,000 megawatts. We haven't seen this level of demand over the last couple of years. As it is, Eskom is battling to supply just 28,000 megawatts on any given day. So I don't know how they're going to fill that 35,000 megawatt gap.
Ms. Mashele, Andre Deracia earlier on also speaking about the diesel suppliers, saying that we're currently sitting at around 67%, saying obviously it's not ideal. We should be, to be safe, north of 80%. And there's also speculation that we might need up to 101 days of load shedding during this winter period. How can we insulate ourselves, if at all? And I'm talking also about consumers, because there is a disproportionality of how load shedding and what I'll remember the term again, how that is applied. I mean, there are areas that go for days without electricity supply that doesn't come back on. And I think anybody who has been in the township can say it is a fact that black areas do go more without power than in the suburban areas. So how do we deal with this situation and also ensure that we bring the economy back to an even keel, that we encourage productivity, especially small to medium businesses that do need to revive themselves?
Absolutely. So you bring about a very important point, and I think you were referring to load limiting,
Yes.
which is what Eskom carries out as a result of the transformer issues that they have. And yes, it does disproportionately affect black communities more. And it's unfortunate that people have decided that this should be the case and not a system. It is not those people's fault that there are people coming into those areas. They do not have housing, they require housing, they set up, informal housing, and they need to connect to the electricity in order just to survive as well. This would typically obviously not happen in a suburban area or would not happen in a Gulf estate. But unfortunately in the township, this does happen, and township inhabitants are then adversely affected by what is happening. Okay, so in terms of, how to insulate ourselves really, I'm not going to refer to wealthy, customers that can get solar PV batteries here, but in terms of, ordinary people, let's look at solar lighting for our homes. These are lights, they're inexpensive lights, about 60 Rand, 50 Rand that you can leave outside, in the sun, or even like on your windowsill. It can, attract light, and you can make sure that you have light in the evening. Looking at cooking with, gas, they are, looking at, lighting, solar, just lighting that you install in your house that has a small little battery. You've got systems that are as inexpensive as about 1,000 Rand that you can install in your house. Comes with 4 little lights and it's got, a battery. Again, I might say that 1,000 Rand is inexpensive, but for people that are living on 3,500 Rand a month, perhaps I am being very, very ambitious as well.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, Ms. Lungile Mashele, and sharing your expertise. Much, much appreciated. Energy expert there, Lungile Mashele. Moving on, sir.